All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mariela Freire, and I'm the Communications Director at Texas Folklife. And I'm joined by Dr. Alicia Oliver. She is our Director at Texas Folklife. And we are honored to have Leticia Urieta join us tonight for a special author talk presented by Texas Folklife. Leticia, is a celebrated Tejana writer based in Austin, Texas. She serves the Austin community as a dedicated teaching artist and is the program director of Austin Bat Cave, a literary nonprofit supporting young writers. Leticia also co-directs Barrio Writers Austin and Pflugerville, providing free creative writing workshops for youth. She holds degrees from Agnes Scott College and Texas State University, and her writing has been published widely in journals and magazines, including Electric Lit, Lumina, The Offing, and more. In 2018, she published the chapbook, The Monster, with Libro Mobile Press. We are thrilled to be discussing her hybrid collection, Las Criaturas, today. This book was a finalist for the prestigious Sergio Troncoso Award for Best First Book of Fiction in 2022. Las Criaturas blends poetic and speculative narratives to give voice to untold stories of women. Leticia plays with traditional storytelling forms and folklore to explore themes of the monstrous, vulnerable, and beautiful in the feminine experience. Leticia's magical collection seeks to reclaim power in situations of powerlessness. Please join me in welcoming the phenomenally talented Leticia Urieta.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that introduction.
So thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. And I do want to say thank you. We have the University of North Texas Women and Gender Studies Special Topics class with us tonight that are listening in, and they have we'll have some questions toward the end. But just want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know that writers have certain habits and different kind of writing rituals. So I hope that we didn't pull you away from those. But just kind of want to open up tonight to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
No, thank you so much again for having me. It was just a wonderful surprise, and I thank everyone for being here tonight. Yeah, I am a writer and teaching artist, kind of as Mariela mentioned in my intro. And what that looks like for me is I do work full time with two nonprofits, and so I organize programs and I support teaching artists who work for us, who are in schools doing after school programs, specifically offering creative writing programs to a variety of ages. But then on the side, I also offer classes both for youth and for adults. I actually have a class coming up next week through Austin Bat Cave that I can share the link for, specifically centered around body horror, which is a genre that I'm like really kind of getting into, specifically in the next collection that I'm working on. And yeah, I'm from Austin, Texas originally. I grew up here and have roots in Texas, kind of several generations back. I went away to college in Atlanta, or kind of Decatur, suburb of Atlanta, for 4 years at Agnes Scott College, and then returned. And I worked as a bilingual elementary school teacher for 6 years before deciding that I wanted to get my MFA in creative writing at Texas State. And that's kind of what led me to Barrio Writers and to Austin Bat Cave, and these other communities that were offering community-based creative writing workshops, which is a big passion of mine now. I think that's a little bit about me.
No, thank you. That was fantastic. So before we launch into some of the questions I have, you mentioned, did you say body horror? Is that?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? I've not heard of that genre of literature before.
Yeah, absolutely. You see this a little bit in Las Criaturas. I think there's actually like quite a few pieces that are leaning towards this, but I am a huge horror fan. I've been reading and watching horror even when I was like a sensitive little baby. who cried and then had nightmares and got scared at everything. But something about horror and kind of controlled fear, I guess, or being able to like engage with fear through that genre was really appealing to me. And body horror is like a subgenre of that, that specifically deals with like the horror found in the human body, through sickness, through assault, right? Kind of body modifications. I think you could say that like possession is a form of that as well. So that's kind of what I've been most interested in because, as someone who is chronically ill and has undergone over the last several years, a lot of like traumatic medical experiences, that's where a lot of my writing is leaning towards now.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I did. I don't want to give too much away, but I did see that now that you've given us that explanation and framework to work with. I did see that in some of the pieces, and so now that I'm able to make the connections, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write Las Criaturas?
Absolutely. So when I started writing this book, I was in my second year at Texas State, and I was also um, this was when I like was in the transition away from teaching elementary. So like for the first year, I was commuting like over an hour to get to school after working all day at teaching, um, and doing night classes multiple days a week. And I was by my second year, I was feeling it like in my body, and that's when I started to also have more chronic pain, chronic illness, stuff coming into my life, and which was becoming really debilitating. And at the same time, I was struggling in my program with, how do I describe this diplomatically? With what we I think we see sometimes in academia, which is, a cohort where folks are supposed to be in community with one another, but if like conscious community is not being created, um, a lot of people are left out, especially like marginalized folks, women, especially women of color, and like other folks that I knew were struggling as well. And so I think that was really challenging for me. I didn't always feel like I had the same support that like my white male counterparts were getting, from faculty members, and wasn't necessarily like vibing with a lot of the work that I was being assigned. Um, and at the same time, this was also in 2016 when the extremely racist rhetoric, racist, xenophobic, misogynist rhetoric of the Trump campaign was occurring. And I think just all of those things combined really started to influence the work. And so while I was supposed to be working on my what would eventually become my thesis, which was a novel, um, I was writing these like really weird, angry poems and stories on the side. And I was in a fiction program, so I wasn't supposed to be writing poetry too. So um and they kind of just started to like coalesce into the point where I was like, oh my God, this is actually like, this feels interconnected. This feels like there's some kind of conversation happening between these pieces. Um, and then with the monster, which is the first story in the collection, I gave that to a friend at the University of Houston who was in the creative writing program there, and they just acquired a risograph machine, and she was like, hey, just give me a short story, I want to do like a little chapbook print. And they've only printed like 10 copies, and it was a really cute little thing. And Lucero Hernandez, who was an artist in Houston, did the illustration for it. And then my friend Sara Garcia at Libro Mobile Press wanted to print additional copies, and so she did a short run of that, and it kind of spiraled from there. And that's kind of how the collection coalesced. And I have a really wonderful partner in Flower Song Press, which is out of McAllen, Texas. I think they're printing and just publishing and supporting a lot of really progressive authors, who are doing some really beautiful things with poetry and really beautiful work that is not it's not mainstream work that you would see from some of the big five publishers. So that's kind of that's kind of how it happened.
It's really fascinating, to hear you talk about some of the politics involved in academia, and I think that's something that um, a lot of folks don't talk about, because it is very political. And you talk about this sense of community with your cohort, and how many times that can be isolating. So for you to make that transformation is really remarkable. Can you share or talk a little bit about some of the themes or frameworks that are central to your writing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my writing is definitely centered in the body. I think that comes through a lot. Um, I I write from a chronically ill, disabled perspective a lot of the time, and so that's something I think that comes through. Um, and sometimes exploring like the beauty in that, sometimes exploring the absurdity in what the body does or is capable of. And then I think in this book in particular, it's also looking at, kind of what happens to really vulnerable people, whether they're children or women or creatures, non human creatures who are, pushed to the breaking point in some way, either by displacement, by incarceration, by, violence of some kind, and what kinds of transformations or changes can happen to make them feel like they are healing or are powerful in some way. um, I've always been interested in exploring monsters. Monsters have always fascinated me, especially as they crop up and across a variety of traditional stories and folklore. Um, and I think that that's something I gravitate towards, and I don't know that's something I will ever stop exploring in my work. That's something like I said, I'm working on a new collection of stories, and that's something that I feel like is coming up a lot.
Is there one particular story that really speaks to you from folklore?
Oh gosh, it's hard. Um, I think like I admire how a lot of Mexican American authors, you know, especially based in Texas, have explored the stories of the lechuza, right? The kind of witchy demon owls and La Llorona, um, and the Cucuy and kind of other, folk tales like that. I don't know that I gravitate towards any one or the other. I think I definitely like hybrid creatures, just because like culturally and just about myself, that's where I often feel like I come from. Um, and so yeah, anytime that there's like an opportunity to explore hybridity, and like not centering on a like I'm trying to think how to put this, like not centering on any one experience over another, I think is always interesting. um my mom's side of the family is has descendants in Germany and Ireland, and some of those are also like folklore that I explore, and also kind of thinking about the Mexican American side of my family and what stories, like, I also think that it can be really interesting to pull from like your own familial folklore, right? It's not just about what are the stories that are common to your culture, because that also looks very regionally different for everybody. So sometimes it's about what are the stories that your family have told over and over that kind of stick in your head, and how did that shape your understanding of the world? Um, Hopefully that answered that question.
Absolutely. And when you talk about folklore and thinking about what folk life is, and the transmission of stories through generations, um, you get to see how that shapes the experience for many people. Thinking about Texas, as we're having in our preliminary discussion, Texas is a huge state, and with that, there are these different regions within Texas, and they're maybe strands of the same story, but it gets changed depending on the teller. Um, can you can you share your process for character development?
Mm, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of like in the midst of it right now. I think it does look different based on different projects. I'm notoriously bad at having my hands in a lot of fires. I said that to another Texas horror writer recently at an event, Johnny Compton, who is also wonderful, based out of San Antonio. He has a new book out called Spite House right now that I would highly recommend. It's on my to be read list. Um, but him and I were talking about that, and normally people talk about like your irons in the fire, but sometimes it's like your hands are actually in the fire. That's how close the work feels. And I've been working on some stuff recently that sometimes when it gets really close to your heart, your own emotional truth based in in particular on like some of your personal experiences, like you can make your own self cry. That's always a good that's a good starting place. But I think for shorter pieces, if I really want to kind of explore an idea, I don't know that I always necessarily need to go into a ton of detail about a character, but I want to think about like what is the kind of emotional heart of this, and how can I explain that in the most concise way possible? What kind of images or what kind of like moments for this character are going to kind of cut to the heart of who they are and what they're going through in this moment, versus a novel, which I am also working on a YA novel right now, also based in Austin, and that's going to be a historical, kind of a paranormal historical fiction. Um, that one, I feel like I have a little bit more breathing room to explore who this character is, and so to be honest with you, as I'm like working through that process, I still feel like I'm learning who she is and like what her story is. So I think it does depend on what your goal is for the work, and yeah, and kind of what do you want to leave the reader feeling by the end of it.
Yeah, I know that if there's if I'm reading, whether it is a short piece or a much longer novel, um, I can envision what that character looks like and what they're feeling. And to me, that is just a sign of good writing. And so I was able to do that in your pieces in Las Criaturas. Is there a specific character in any of the works that you've written that you feel a strong connection to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. All of them are different. Also, considering the fact that like some of these I started writing, now like almost like 6 7 years ago. So there's been some distance, and it's interesting whenever I do a reading or I do a book event. It's like you're rediscovering who that character was, or who that character is, and like what they meant to you at the time of writing it. Um, and you can almost like slip back into the voice of that character and the thinking of them. So it really depends. I think the story that I kind of come back to, that I've actually been exploring a not sequel, but like another iteration of that character, is the and many of the characters in this are unnamed, so that's another part of it that's kind of challenging, is like but in Sick Woman Travels to Distant Lands, that one I think was as one that I wrote more recently, and I included in the book. Kind of wasn't sure if it was going to fit, and then I think it eventually did. So I think that character definitely still resonates with me. um I also think that you know i I work with youth all the time, and I work when I'm talking with them about their writing. A lot of them are very open about the fears that they have, um, whether it's around school shootings and violence that they're experiencing or kind of afraid of, or whether it's kind of an issue of like their ability to access books because of the political climate that we're in right now. And so I think the monster and kind of that inhabiting that mindset is sometimes really challenging, but I go back to that story just because it was one of the harder ones for me to write. But it felt important at the time, especially knowing how many, young immigrant children are still being incarcerated on a daily basis. I think about that literally every day. So yeah.
And that is one that I want us to really, kind of tease apart in just a little bit because that when I read that, I was thinking about the political climate that we found ourselves in, in these past several years and what that looks like, and what that looks like specifically for women and children. And I noticed that in this body of work, women are a central focus in their experiences. Can you share a little bit about um, why you took that direction and just a little bit of background about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like playing with gender is always fun, and I would say for any writer, just because you inhabit a specific gender experience doesn't mean that that's all you need can write. And I have written, of course, outside of that. But I think at the time that I was working on these pieces, maybe it was also that I was like digging into some feminist theory. So I was reading Women Who Run with Wolves and some of these other kind of fundamental texts that were also definitely influencing some of my work. But I think it was also that I was in a, what felt like kind of a misogynist environment, where my stories, didn't always feel respected. And um, I think that, to be honest with you, a lot of this book was written out of anger, and it was kind of a reactionary book. I think it became more than that because it's still like if it were just coming from anger, I don't think it would have stood the test of time for me, like creatively. Um, but I think sometimes when you start there and then you put more of your heart and kind of the truthfulness of experience into it, it can become something closer to you and more important to you. Um, but I did feel like I wanted to write at least from the place of vulnerability and who are folks who are vulnerable either because of their gender, because of their age, because of, what's happening to them, how their bodies are being, violated in some way or used, or, how they feel out of control. And I wanted to kind of explore, I guess, just the messiness, the monstrousness, the unruliness of what a woman or a person from that experience could feel if they were to let go of some of the expectations for them.
That's remarkable. Thinking about this concept of the monster, how would you define being monstrous, or what the characteristics of a monster?
It's funny, I think about this a lot, and it's like if you ever follow some of the like horror TikToks, which I watch, sometimes I do TikTok for breaks and stuff like that. But there's a lot of folks, especially around like Halloween, who are dressing up as like horror villains, like Pennywise and Freddy Krueger and all these different people. And I always enjoy that, as someone who loves those movies. But I think it's interesting to think about um, monsters that are like supernatural because they are outside of the control of what humanity deems like behavior that is acceptable, I guess, right? To consume children, for instance, right? From a Pennywise perspective, if you're familiar with this character from It, that's pretty terrifying, right? Because you literally have no control over an entity like that. But it's interesting too when you have a lot of these horror characters that are men, many of whom are also like enacting sexualized violence, right? Um, I kind of wanted to like move outside of that. Not that there's, well, there's definitely stuff wrong, and people, many theorists have written about why that's a problem, but I wanted to move kind of outside of that and explore. is someone being labeled a monster because they are unwilling to submit to the treatment that they have formerly been, um, submitting to, or is it because they're really enacting like a form of harm or violence? And so I think like that's the line I wanted to explore too, and like allowing for some of that violence to come back, whether it's like a vengeance or whether it's a, hey, this horrible thing is happening to me. Why shouldn't I be able to be, the monster that you think I am kind of situation? Um, so yeah, and in a body horror perspective, there's a lot obviously there's a lot of violence done to women and femme people whose bodies in the medical industrial complex are done innumerable harm, right, all the time. And so I think like that's another place where I feel like I'm leaning towards, to explore monstrousness. It's like if this absurd thing is happening inside my body or someone is, harming my body under the idea of care, then how am I, kind of flipping that around a little bit, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That is very profound. Hearing you explain that, and then it's kind of like this rupture that happens, that um this transition takes place, and you move from more of this docile being into someone that is very empowered and in many ways has configured their own ways of being, whether it's through performance or whether it's through the construction of the self. So that's really unique. Were there any challenges that you faced when you were writing Las Criaturas?
Yeah, for sure. Well, just to touch on what you were just talking about too, I was going to say that I also think that it's really easy sometimes for us to say like, okay, well, I put this character in a situation where they fought back against the oppressive systems that they're living in, and now they're all good, right, they're empowered and everything's fine. But I also feel like I want to resist that inclination to make everything all good for them, just because I don't believe that that's how healing works. I don't believe that, I don't know. I don't really believe in easy answers like that, just because both from my own personal experiences, it's just never like that. And so sometimes making a character understandable, but also a little bit reprehensible is okay too. Um, I think that's you know I want to leave room for that messiness sometimes, but yeah, definitely there were pieces in this that I was trying to find a balance between some of the poetry. I was trying to find a balance between some of the stories that had been written, over several years versus newer ones. Wanting to make sure that I felt like there were, enough to kind of get the stories across that I wanted. And I think also just knowing that I wasn't going to take this to like an agent. I just already had that in my head. I was like, there's not an agent that's going to see this and be like, yeah, this is very sellable. It wasn't. Uh, I knew that I wanted a press like Flower Song, a small press that was just doing weird stuff that I could be like, hey, here's this weird little book. You want to publish it? Um, and I had a friend who and a colleague who introduced me to the artist who did the cover art, Elena Almeida, who's a local artist and student at UT. She may have graduated already, actually, but um, she does a lot of art with embodiment and like line art about the body. So this was a little bit outside of her comfort zone, but she read some of the stories and just created this amazing cover. It's like one of my favorite parts of the book, besides the writing, I guess. Um, but yeah, I think those are always some of the challenges with creating a book. And also, one of my really good friends, Joe Reyes Boitel, who is also an amazing poet, who is also from Texas, who I would highly recommend. I'll send a list. but she was also helping to edit my book through Flower Song. And at some point, she was like, Leticia, you have to let this go. You cannot keep revising. Um, so, I tell my students this all the time. It's not done, it's just due. But I had to like take that advice begrudgingly, I guess.
I like that. It's not done. It's just due. It's something that I think for many who aspire to like get into this creative practice of writing, and one of the things that I tell my students that language is a tool, and it just depends on how you use it. I think that that's something that I'd like to share with them, that it you may not feel it's done, but it's due. And so to do that, are there any types of rituals or writing habits that you have?
I am really stop and go. I'll just be honest that I often um I often say this to students, especially like folks that ask me like, how do I get into writing or stuff like that. And I tend to disagree with a lot of writers who say you need to be writing every day. Um Personally, just because I think that's a little bit ableist. It's just not realistic for most people who, and especially if you're considering, like, I'm a big Stephen King fan, love Stephen King, and a lot of folks like him. But sometimes I think, you know, people are so impressed by his writing practices and how quickly he can get books out and how prolific he is. But are they asking who's doing the emotional labor of allowing him the space to do that? Who's raising the kids? Who's doing the other stuff, right? So like, not to shame him in some way, but sometimes I think about that. It's like a lot of these authors, uh especially men, are maybe not always doing that labor. And so I think like there's a lot of other obstacles for people who are raising families, people who have medical issues, people who are in school. um yeah, just a lot of other stuff going on. So all that's to say that, for me personally, I usually kind of write in small doses, write in sprints, but I would always say that, like, find a practice that works for you, whatever that looks like. As long as you feel like you're kind of touching base, with yourself, and whether that's like you journal every morning, or maybe you're after your kids go to bed and you're up late at night, whatever that looks like for you, or you like to write in a coffee shop or a library. I think as long as you feel like you are giving yourself the gift of creative space, that's what I hope to be able to do for myself. And I know I can feel it in my body when I'm not, doing that, when I'm not feeding my creative engine. Um, yeah.
That's I think about what writing or the creative process feels like somatically, and I think for those who are engaged in any type of creative work, when you're not feeding, and I'm using feeding as kind of this metaphor, when you're not feeding yourself in that way, you start to feel it, and things are not aligned as they should be in your world. Are there specific artists or works of literature that have influenced your writing and continue to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. I put one in the chat. Rios de la Luz. She is a writer, originally from Tulsa, who lived in El Paso for some time, and um, she's just an amazing writer, writing from the Mexican American and Guatemalan perspective, writing from the queer brown girl perspective. A lot of her work is, addressing violence against women, is addressing like the violence that, she has found kind of in her experience with the Catholic Church. I'm working on a review of her latest book right now, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. But a lot of the work that she has done in the last few years, and then with language and her description, is just amazing. And I always recommend her work. At the back of my book, there, I just want to like point out, because it's something I was really happy to be able to do. Yeah, thank you. There is a reading list, and then there's some writing prompts. Just because I've been a teacher for about a decade now, I guess maybe a little bit more. Ooh. Um, and I just it's in me to like want to be able to give something back to whoever's like engaging with this work. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of pieces in that. Carmen Maria Machado, I think, is also someone who, should be on everyone's bookshelf. I remember that's probably the one gift that one of my professors gave me was a short story of hers in, I think it was like Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy Collection of 2016. And I read one of her short stories, and I think you have to find the people who are going to blow your brain open, if that makes sense. Like the people who are going to help you either in their voice or their form or whatever it is that they're doing, they're going to help you imagine what your work could be if you throw off some of the expectations that are sometimes imposed upon us when we think of what good writing is. I hate using so many air quotes, but you know what I mean? Like, I think that's something that a lot of these writers have taught me is, just to be a little bit more honest and a little bit more, a little bit less fearful in my work.
That's thinking about some of the lessons that they taught you. But as you really start to be reflective and think about what you've read or the different professors that you've had or the different themes that emerge in your writing, were there things that you didn't know about yourself that you discovered through your writing process?
Yeah, I mean, I think like writing horror is really new to me. I've loved horror for most of my life. I never thought that I would write it. And when I went to my MFA program, you go to a graduate program in that field to kind of get serious about your work, right? And you're there to like study the serious literature and of course, like I was assigned some stories that I felt like did align with my work sometimes, but a lot of the time it was, mainstream writers who I didn't always feel like a connection to. And I think what has surprised me most is just how weird my brain can get. And I share stories with my husband Ramiro all the time, and he's like, that was weird. It's like, what did I just read? You have a dark, twisted little mind. And I was like, yes. And I wrote a very vulnerable essay that was published last year, that is pretty graphic and like kind of disturbing. And yeah, I got feedback from this one woman who said that it was one of the most disturbing things she's read in a long time. And I was like, cool, mission accomplished. So yeah.
You know, I think for me, and when I was reading your work, I was like, I didn't really know what to expect.
Mm,
And so I started reading, and I think it's not that I have a fear of snakes, but I have a healthy fear. And so when we were talking about when we were looking at that story that you've written,
hmm.
and for those who have not had the opportunity, I don't want to give it away, but when we were in the room, and I was in the room with the individuals in the snake tanks, and I'm like, how did this come about? Um, and so that's why I want to ask you, how did that come about as uh, thinking about what that looks like? And then again, I want to give any spoilers for those who haven't read this selection. But I was in the room and I was like, I need to put this one down for a while before I come back to it.
Yeah, it's funny. That actually has a pretty specific story as far as inspiration was concerned. So when I was younger, I've always really loved reptiles. And when I was younger, my parents were divorced, and my dad would which is not great. I lived with my mom most of the time, but I would spend time with my dad on the weekends. My dad would have a really not awesome habit of getting me pets that then he didn't have to deal with, like bunny rabbits and cats. And I begged and begged and begged for a snake. And he went and took me one day to get a king snake. And of course, like my mom was the one who had to keep the rats in the freezer and or the mice in the freezer and actually deal with it. And she hates snakes, but she allowed it for a time. Um, we ended up having to rehome her because she was striking at me and striking at the cage. And I think like that experience, and then over time, I when I was teaching elementary, I would always get really excited when the like Austin Zoo would come and bring like the big boa constrictors and big pythons, and I would be the one teacher that would be excited to have it like draped on my shoulders. Um, but I like on YouTube, I would sometimes watch these herpetologists or these like at home collectors who would have like 200 plus venomous snakes in their house. And so many of them were men. And it just seemed like there was this interesting like ego trip that was going on with how they felt like that they owned these animals, they controlled these animals that were absolutely out of their control. Like, right, they were not, they're wild animals, and reptiles cannot bond with, mammals. That's just not in their brain to be able to do that. And so it just something about the psychology of that was really interesting. And then, exploring some of the Nawa, kind of myth making and storytelling that I was reading at the time seemed to merge in some way. And I wanted to kind of think about too, like, what happens to deities or goddesses that are displaced, that feel disconnected from their people. And so that's kind of how that rolled into this. Yeah. So
When I read that one, just I think because I could picture myself in that space, and it's like this is a very uncomfortable space for me to occupy. But then on the flip side of that, as someone who has always appreciated Medusa,
mm,
and thinking about what that looks like, and how the snakes were in essentially her crown and what
hmm,
all of that embodies. I thought that was really it was kind of a contradiction for me internally, but I was like, well, this is really interesting. And kind of in the same vein, and kind of shifting gears a little bit, because I want to allow time for question and answers, but want to talk about the monster, the first
hmm.
reading in Las Criaturas. What I know that we mentioned a little bit about that, thinking about the politics and everything that it continues to happen. Those stories that don't get told about women and children at the borders. Can you share a little bit about the writing process for the monster, and what that was like for you?
Absolutely. It's definitely one of the most challenging stories I've ever written. And I even debated for a long time about whether it felt like my story to write because it is a very specific type of story. Um, at the time that I wrote it, I was teaching second grade, and all of my students, most of my students were bilingual students, and most of them were either the children of immigrants from Mexico or Central America, or were recently arrived themselves. And so our school day would often look like teaching in English and Spanish. And I remember that was the year I had, because I'd been teaching at that school for several years, I had siblings. So like I taught several, generations of one family. And one of them was asking me, one of the moms was asking me to write a letter on behalf of her family so that they could apply for a green card for protected status. And I think at the time I was writing that, seeing the rhetoric from the Trump campaign and how that was igniting what is very much already like a very xenophobic and racist, you know, rhetoric around the border wall, and kind of specifically what that looked like in Texas. Um, because let's be real, that's always been there. It's not new. Um, but I think it was amplified, right? And especially kind of around this, like, build the wall idea, promise, whatever that looks like. Um, and I was thinking too, and I think we should also like acknowledge that the Obama administration was also incarcerating families, and that is continued with the Biden administration as well. So like, it's not all political parties and all people have blood on their hands. You know, sorry if that's new, but yeah, I think that seeing, you know, the way that a lot of these families were treated, and this has only become more horrific under the, with Greg Abbott's administration. But I was thinking specifically about what does it do to, a child like the kids I was around every single day? What does it do to a kid like that to be told that you're illegal, that you are a criminal in some way when you are like 6 years old? When you are bad, that your family's bad, that you shouldn't be here. And just like the kind of heartlessness and lack of compassion, but also that combined with being surveilled, which is a big part of a lot of these families' lives, I think was just churning in my mind. And that's where the monstrousness kind of came about. Like, how would this make this child feel? And then bringing in kind of a speculative or supernatural, feeling around that, and what happens when you tell yourself a story, but that story starts to become out of your control, right? Um, and I think I remember when I was workshopping this piece, and I told it from a second person direct address perspective, and also in present tense, and those are two kind of like those are two perspectives that a lot of folks resist. They don't like being in that space. And I remember kind of defending that because I wanted people to feel like you couldn't escape that. It was happening to you, it was happening in this moment. Um, and even rereading it now, I'm like, I still stand by this because I think, it's really easy for us to deflect that that's not my experience. This doesn't have anything to do with me. It's really easy for us to turn away. And no, I do that. We all have to live our lives, right? But like, I think that was one of the reasons why this particular story like still sticks with me. And I'm glad that people are reading and engaging with it. I also hope that, people who read and engage with it are engaging with the efforts to end the incarceration of migrant families. And I definitely don't feel like I've done enough in that arena for sure. I work with some of these families, and definitely support some of the local organizations that are doing that work. But yeah, it's a really heartbreaking situation, and unfortunately it's only getting worse.
Thank you for that. I'm going to open it up for questions, and we only have a little bit of time left. But I want to share that when that's one of the stories that I've reread a few times, and each time, coming away with a different feeling. And I think this last reading, there was a sense of suffocation, if you will.
Mm,
I think I was reading it maybe from the mom's perspective, and like just kind of being suffocated, and as you said, not being able to get out of that space as a reader, and really thinking about how this resonates with other folks, what that looks like in terms of activism or being an advocate or an ally. I want to thank you for this beautiful discussion. While we have about 10 minutes left, one of the questions, and I'm going to open it up, but one of the questions I have from one of the students from the Women and Gender Studies courses, why did you also choose to showcase the monster as not just their enemy that kept them captivated, but inner reflections of themselves as well?
yeah, I mean, I I want to just share really quickly before I lose the thought. I got to talk with another author who is undocumented and has written a memoir about this. So I'm going to put that link in the chat as well. Marcelo Hernandez Castillo, who wrote a memoir called Children of the Land. And he captures the emotional distress that causes children specifically to be surveilled at all times, to be threatened. So I just would highly, highly recommend that book. But yeah, I mean, I think that again, like one of the things that I wanted for this character was to capture not just the feelings from the guards, from kind of the people that were incarcerating them, but also the resentment from that they felt about their mom, that they felt about having to caretake their younger sibling who, even as much as you can as an older as an older oldest child in a family who has had to do that a lot, obviously not in this situation, but I think that there is some resentment that goes with that, um like that you're having to manage everyone's feelings but your own, right? And you're also having to act right, whatever that looks like, so that people don't think, that you're bad in some way. And unfortunately, I see that a lot in our school systems too, with kids who are, just hyper surveilled by every single adult that they come in contact with, even their teachers who are, loving and supportive, which so many of them are. But it's like, so many of them are growing up with that feeling all the time of like, I can't do anything. I can't be a kid, or I'm going to be considered a bad kid in some way. Um, so I think that's what I wanted to kind of get at with that, bringing that monstrousness is like, what does that look like when they're pushed to the breaking point and they can't take it anymore?
Thank you. That is, I just kind of at a loss for words when that question came through, and I was thinking, that's really it's kind of a unique question to pose, and not only thinking about these internal reflections, but how they can be outward facing and kind of
Mm.
a projection as well. Do we have any other questions? Someone asked me. We asked them in chat. Yes, yes, you may.
Hoping y'all can't hear my Halloween decoration outside that's like making lots of noise.
So one of the questions that I see is, how do you approach the representation of women in your writing, especially in contexts where they might be seen as monstrous?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and I guess that kind of goes back to this other question about the child. Like, I don't want to contribute to negative stereotypes for sure, but I just think that I don't know how to describe it, but I think that like making room for messiness and for everyone to have the opportunity, to if they are pushed to the point where they are violent, like it's not to excuse violence or to say that like, oh, monsters make monsters, right? But like oftentimes in my experience, especially seeing the results of familial trauma over several generations and the results of abuse over several generations, I think it is very true that like hurt people. And that's not to excuse their actions, but it is, you know for me it's a way to kind of show like sometimes that's how that happens, and it's not to say this is good or bad, it's just to show it and to like let you make the conclusion about how you feel about that, right? And hopefully, that character can find a sense of healing or a sense of empowerment, or at least autonomy over their bodies or over themselves. But yeah, I think that that's not necessarily assigning judgment to them if they become a monster, if they become monstrous in some way. It's kind of
Thank
why my actually, you asked this question earlier. I should have had an answer for this. werewolves are one of my favorite, and like werewolf stories across the board are some of my favorite monster stories because they are in almost every single culture. And I think they are just some of the best, like, not just because their transformations are really interesting and cool, but also because I think they represent that duality and like struggle inside. So anyway, yeah. Sorry, I know there are other
No,
questions.
I have a whole nother werewolf story that I will share with you.
Ooh,
Well, uh,
please.
yeah, it's kind of a I want to say a real life experience, but I will share that with you off camera.
Okay.
We have a question. It says, "Are any of the characters based off of people that you know, or composite characteristics of different people?"
Oh, definitely. And like I, especially with well, with some of these stories and then other stories that I'm like currently working on, a lot of it is informed by personal experience, or I kind of think about like the character in the monster is not any one of my students, but it's like a lot of her characteristics are based on experience or conversations I had with students, or what have you, and then kind of letting the imagination take it from there. um the character in La Mujer Alacrán kind of is also like exploring some of the feelings I had when I was able to study in first semester in Mexico when I was in my undergraduate, and like being Mexican American in Mexico and kind of the feelings around that, and also being like hypersexualized. So um, yeah, there's definitely characters that, and some of them are composites of people I don't like as well. So, yeah.
And the next question, what advice would you give to fellow writers who are not sure how to publish a book but have intentions to do so?
That's a big question for sure. I think, um, you know, one way I would start is if you have a book, depending on what kind of book it is, obviously, if it's a memoir, if it's a novel, if there are pieces of it that you can submit to other places, that's one way to start thinking about it. And because that's how you start to also like get a name for yourself. It's how you start to kind of get your work into spaces that you may want, and that's sometimes also how you find connections with, agents or other presses that you may want to publish a larger work with. Um, and I think too, you need to read those magazines, whether it's whether it's the New York Times, right, or if that's what you're shooting for, or whether like me right now, a lot of what I'm researching is like speculative fiction and horror magazines. Those are where I'm trying to like find places to publish my work, because that's a really new area for me, like from a industry perspective. And so um, I think you have to read those places where you want to see your work, and like research the editors that you would like to work with, because those are the people that um, you could be working with if you're submitting a short story or a poem or what have you. And it's good to start following those people sometimes on social, not physically follow them, don't stalk them, but like follow them on social media, see what kinds of work they're publishing, because that's also really helpful. And I just, as someone who also did a little bit of editing, I know that it was the bane of every editor's existence when you have someone who's like sending the same story to like every press that they've ever heard of, like 200 presses, and they don't actually care about any of them. You know what I mean? Like, that's not great. Don't do that.
And we have one more question. She has segment says amazing advice. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
From Grace, do you think the idea of the monster is being reclaimed in modern media, such as recent books, movies, and TV shows?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. If you think my to be read list is long, my to watch list is also very long. Um, I don't think that the writer's strike was a good thing as far as what for the writers. I mean, it is good now because they signed a wonderful contract, and I'm hoping that the actors get the same. But I was a little bit grateful for a pause, at least in some of the programming, just because I'm so behind. But like, oh, there's so much. there's so much out there right now, especially because of streaming, and like I think weird stories, horror stories specific, and I know I harp on this a lot, but that's kind of what is in my like purview right now. I think are having a really interesting moment where, you know, more filmmakers who are, you know, like more indigenous filmmakers, and more women filmmakers and folks who are, you know, telling like kind of perspectives and stories that are really, you know, not what we've seen in mainstream. I think are exploring monstrousness. Um, and again, too, like I think when you think of monsters, oftentimes what I think, and you know, werewolf stories are like complicit in this too. Traditional werewolf stories sometimes are very much like, oh no, he was such a nice man until he, you know, ripped the throats out of that entire village, most of whom were women and children, right? But he's really good deep down. It's like, what does that sound like? That's not great. But then if you kind of move away from that thinking, I sometimes wonder, like, yeah, what are the other possibilities that we can see? And I feel like I could give a lot of suggestions off the top of my head, but I feel like I would have to curate a better list. So I'm happy to also do that.
Well, I think we're right at time. I know that we had another question from Greenlee, but I think you mentioned it. Since you've been writing, have you discovered anything about yourself that you didn't know before? And you know, I think you kind of you know, commented on that earlier. But is there anything else that you would like to say about that?
um, yeah, I mean, like, I think I did say this earlier that I definitely feel, you know, I'm gonna be 37 this month. And I am starting to realize that I'm kind of moving into my like senora era. You know what I mean? Like I'm moving into, you know, I work with a lot of colleagues now who are in their, you know, early to mid 20s, and I'm realizing like I'm kind of in, you know, starting to become not an elder yet, but maybe a little bit. And so what's nice about that though is the ideas that I had about what I thought my writing life was going to be like, I just don't care anymore. Like I just want to write the weird shit. Sorry, but like I just want to write that and um write whatever feels the most like emotionally truthful to me, because I guess what I come back to is that we only have a limited time on this earth to be, you know, to create the work that we want to see in the world. And so I think that's what I kind of come back to is like, and you know, the reality is like, this, sorry to be macabre, but you know, I've had to face my own mortality because of illness and other things over the last couple of years. And I think we've all had to, especially because of the ongoing pandemic that we're living in too. And like, you know, not necessarily moving away from a time in your life in which you kind of felt like maybe your life or your life expectancy was guaranteed also kind of makes you understand that yeah, that you need to be able to like get to the heart of it sooner rather than later, right? If that makes sense. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a downer to end on, but that is something that I am thinking about.
No, that was perfect. Leticia, thank you so much for being with us. Just want to thank all those who were in attendance tonight.
Okay.
It was just a remarkable talk. I can't wait to read what you have for us in the future.
Yeah.
And off camera, I will tell you my werewolf story.
Okay. Yes, I have to hear this.
But I just
Uh,
want to say thank you once again. Thank you everyone for being here, and you all have a great night.
yeah. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.